Good afternoon. It is December 21st, 2018. We are here today with Gregg Hockemeyer. I am Deb Lawrence, and this video is for the Peabody Public Library Oral History Project. That's a lot to spit out.
It is.
How are you today?
I'm fine. Yourself?
No, not too bad.
Good.
What would you like to talk about today?
Well, I think I'd like to start off talking about, since I'm practicing law here in town, and I'm from Columbia City area originally, kind of my perceptions of how the legal practice has evolved during my lifetime.
Cool.
Here locally. And my first sort of recollections, and I know there were always more attorneys in town, but my first sort of recollections, I suppose, of attorneys doing business here in town probably sprung from when I was in high school. And there were always three to four main law firms in town, and you had the White Leather firm, the Bloom firm, and the Gates firm, and then you also had Joe Rowe, who about that, when I was in high school, Mike Rush would have just started as an attorney. And as to the Gates firm, both when I was in high school, I think right around that time was when Terry Smith and Jim Hewer joined as associates at Gates and McNagny, I think is what the firm was called at that time. And I'm not sure exactly what the dynamics were. And as I'm making gestures here, it's where these places are located.
Where they are in town.
On the courthouse square. Yeah, where the law firms were in the courthouse square. But I think it's interesting because while Columbia City in this has either grown or at least not had its population reduce a great deal, the number of law firms and lawyers has kind of been reduced over that period of time, it seems to me. So yes, we had those four firms. Later on, I know Carl Banks, who had been a trust officer at what was then Citizens National Bank, and then later on Star Financial Bank, at one point broke off and set up a practice. And out in South Whitley, again, I'm looking geographically, I guess I'm north, and I guess that's south. Or I'm looking south, and that's Darlene Naylor had a practice out there, and eventually moved back into Columbia City. But we had that core of folks, and I was not sure what I wanted to do for a living when I was going through high school, but had considered law, had considered going into teaching, all sorts of things. I ended up going to college at Wabash College, which is a small liberal arts school in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And I did start off in a secondary ed program down there, thinking of that as a possibility. In retrospect, I think I would have been just an awful English teacher, but that would have been the path that I was following. I would have been the English teacher that really thought he was cool, and none of the students thought were cool. Like, and I'd turn my back and hey kids, come on. But didn't go down that path. Instead, about my junior year, probably decided that I would focus on either going to graduate school in speech or rhetoric, or I even considered library science, or law school. And like most boring kids at that age, I ended up going to law school. And first started off, I worked my way through law school. And attended law school in Indianapolis at the IU school that's located there, and worked full-time in Indianapolis while I did that.
What kind of work did you do?
Well, my first job was at what was then Indiana National Bank, which later became INB, which later became NBD, and later on was one of the many banks purchased by Chase. But was working at Indiana National Bank in their collections department, and which was an interesting experience. And frankly, I do some collection work as an attorney now too, but it was very different. This was calling people on the phone and telling them they needed to make their car payment, or explaining that their car would be repossessed, sometimes calling guarantors. But that was working at the bank there, and I was not really great at that. And so after about 6 months, I got transferred into special securities, which was a department that probably doesn't exist in banks anymore. I assume these things are all done electronically, but it was to get stock certificates in and make sure there were proper endorsements and And it wasn't, in fact, it was like inside a vault. It was like a secured area. After my first year down there, I got a job working with the State Attorney General's office
Oh, I mean,
in their
that was
Consumer
cool.
Protection Division, handling consumer disputes and complaints and mediating those, investigating those. And that's what I did for the balance of the time that I was in law school. I worked at that office. There were lots of law students working there. It was really a pretty natural fit. Then after law school, I passed the bar and applied for my first attorney jobs. And my first attorney job was with the city of Indianapolis, where I worked for their Department of Metropolitan Development. And I did zoning enforcement. So if all these jobs sound really sexy, don't they? So the zoning enforcement meant that I was the guy that got to take people to court that had stacks of tires in their backyard, or that had the wrong sort of signs in the right of way. Sometimes there were more serious things, but it was Municipal 12, and that was my start there. But after a while, it wasn't. The job was a little wearing in that it was the same stuff all of the time. A lot of it was just I just don't think my personality lent itself to working in Indianapolis or into a larger city. I think it was more hearkening back to the times of living in a more pastoral setting, and so the drive just from the suburbs into downtown Indianapolis on the downtown interstates, I would find myself angry and using slurs and screaming at people in traffic and getting into the parking spot and then wrestling to get up to the 14th floor and then sitting down and then had to start work. So anyway, as soon as I got a chance, moved back to this area, and it wasn't necessarily this area. I was looking for someplace just more rural. I was trying to get into a general practice and get out of things there. So had telephoned a couple of attorneys that I was, or through family was at least familiar with, and eventually heard back from Tim Bloom, who said Attorney Terry Smith is looking for an associate. He just left or had recently left the Gates firm and was taking over Mike Rush's practice. Mike Rush was going to assume the Superior Court bench at that time. This would have been about 1992, late 91, early 92. And so I met with Terry, who at that time, interestingly enough, was the state commander for the American Legion.
Yep.
So I met with him down in Indianapolis at that time and visited with him. And we decided that was going to work. So moved up here to join Terry's practice. At that point, it was Terry L. Smith and Associates, and I was his first associate. And later on, I think I was with Terry for, I don't know if it's quite 2 years. I think it was about 2 years. I was approached by another attorney named John Myers. Now, John Myers has been on the library board before. Have you done an oral history with John Myers?
Yes, I have.
Oh, good Lord. Was approached by John Myers. Now, John and I knew each other because we are shirt-tail relation by marriage, okay? And John's, let me see if I can get this correct. John's mother's brother was married to my father's aunt.
Okay.
And that's my Aunt Pat, and it's his Aunt Pat, my great Aunt Pat, actually. Her husband, Paul Harshman, has passed away several years ago. It would have been John's uncle, his mom's brother. So John and I knew of each other, and John thought that perhaps that we could start a law firm of our own. And that's he was also aware that firms were sort of consolidating at this time. It was about this time that the Bloom firm and the White Leather firm started talking to each other. The Gates firm was still there as a separate entity, but at that point, I think it was Bob Gates and Ben Gates. I'm not sure. Dick may have still been with them at that time, but they didn't really have any heir apparent or anybody to sort of take that, looked like it was going to take that firm over, and that ended up not happening. So that it was a situation where it seemed it would be appropriate to have another law firm in town and to have some additional options offered for folks for legal representation. So John and I opened an office. I told Terry about it. Terry wanted to know if we could at least lease space from him, and we did. And our first space was right next to Terry's office in that same complex for the first couple of years.
They're on Main Street.
They're on Main Street. It was Myers and Hockemeyer, and it was right there on Main Street. And I did think that it offered an option. It was, again, a new law firm versus most of these other firms, some that have been around for years, some of which have been around lots and lots of years. And we managed to do pretty well with that. I think it was about 95. By 95, I think, was when we moved to our location at the northwest corner of Chauncey and Van Buren Street. So courthouse, right here.
It's where Strauss's was.
Where Strauss's was, where Strauss's was, and where the fire. Where Strauss's was, where the fire. And we moved there. Actually, they were trying to get a building built. They needed to have an anchor tenant who would take a substantial amount of the space, who would guarantee a 7-year lease, and we would do all of those things. So it was Jerry Reef was the contractor on that, and Bob Smith over at Star Bank was sort of the arranger of most of those things. And so we moved in down there. It was interesting. We had I don't know why we didn't just hire somebody to take things down, but I remember a lot of family members and staff walking down the street with carts and things like that. I guess we didn't have that much at that time, but we did get moved in down there in 95 and spent several years there. During that period of time, as I said, the Gates firm sort of dissipated. It closed up. Dick went over and joined what was at that point then the White Leather Bloom firm. Ben went out and set up a separate practice. I think, I can't remember where Carl Banks was at that time. Terry had sort of stayed as a sole practitioner. But again, what used to be sort of the big three law firms, Blooms and Gates and White Leather, was now effectively just one law firm over there. And John's approaching me and us setting the firm up seemed a little prescient, actually. It seemed like it was pretty good timing. You know, there's an old saying that one attorney in a town will starve, but 2 attorneys in town will do fine. So I don't know if that's true or not, but we managed to do okay there. When we set up the firm, that was the time at which Sultana, John's wife, joined us. She was with the White Leather Bloom firm. And she joined us at this new location, as did Marcia McNagney. Marcia had been practicing on her own with her mom, sort of practicing. I think Marcia basically practiced out of her home.
I think so. Yeah.
She called it. She used to refer to it as her little lemonade stand of practice. It talked about us getting her this big, technical this big conglomerate or whatever, but. Marcia joined us at about that same time too, and so the firm name changed from Myers, Hockemeyer, and McNagney at that point, with Marcia having joined the firm. It was originally Myers and Hockemeyer, even though that's not alphabetical, because we both decided that Hockemeyer and Myers sounded like a weird. It didn't flow very well. It was like aluminum, or it was just. So that's why. I got plugged into second place, even though alphabetically it didn't work that well. It sounded better, and McNagney seemed to sound good at the end, so we've stuck with it. Later on, Earl Tyson also moved over from the Bloom White Leather firm. There does seem to be a theme there with us sort of taking people from that other firm. Everybody's making their own choices there, and joined us over there at that location on West Van Buren. During that time, we evolved. John Myers, who has about a 7-year shelf life in many of his endeavors. John likes variety, and I can't, I don't want to say that it's absolute like this, but when he approached me, he had been at Lincoln National Corporation about 7 years, and we set up this practice, and then he decided that, I think that was the point at which he went to do some political work for Mitch Daniels, gubernatorial campaign. And from that, he spun that into a sort of economic development position with the state. He briefly came back to the law firm, I think, at that point, before going back to Lincoln for a while. He's now economic development director here locally. But we also, as I said, had Earl Tyson. Earl has since moved from the private practice of law entirely. He's now working as in-house counsel, and I think he may be an executive with Schrader Auction.
Oh, wow.
A real estate company, and they worked well together. And he had been assisting them with our firm, or through our firm, for years. But that was an opportunity that he took, and so he has moved on from the firm. That was about the same time that the firm purchased the old, actually right after we purchased the old Posted Mail building.
Yeah.
And I know it was after, because we got in that building, and then he said he was going to, then that's when that sort of was approached by that. We had taken on that new responsibility. It's ended up being fine, but that building had been underutilized, I think is the best way. It had actually been vacant for some period of time, but then Three Birds had taken it over and tried to utilize it. And Tad Varga, bless his heart, he was trying to kind of run his import business and DIY the renovation of that building at the same time. And I think it had just overwhelmed him. It was just too much. And so we did purchase the building. We were able to get some funds to be able to do a substantial renovation of it. We had to replace some of the bricks on the exterior, but we were able to save the footprint and save the basic building. And that was something that we had all felt very strongly about, because I don't want to specifically criticize the school systems, but there had been a lot of purchasing or building of new buildings and sort of abandoning of older buildings in the county at that time. And I don't think that we were a catalyst, but I do think we were part of a movement where that's slowed down and started to turn around a little bit. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 10 years, there has been maybe not a renaissance, but there has been certainly more of an interest in trying to preserve some of the older buildings. They had the same thing with the old McLean and Onspaw McGregor furniture building that has been utilized in that way, and so that's a good thing.
That's marvelous.
Well, and that's that. So we got in that space. We have lots of folks that walk in and look at it and say, "Oh, is this the original ceiling?" And nothing on the interior is the original.
No.
It was a newsroom.
Right.
If you remember what it was like, we had a counter in the front, and any walls that had been installed had been just for purposes of creating some nominal privacy.
A little bit.
None of them were load-bearing walls. The whole structure, as to the main structure where you come in the front door, was all supported by posts and poles throughout.
Right.
And when we did install walls, we have to build them around those poles in different places. We have one in the middle that we didn't get completely taken care of. But for the most part, the architect did a great job of developing that as a law office. We were originally going to demolish what is basically a pole barn structure toward the rear that had been used had a loading dock that had been used for distribution and production. And there were a couple reasons that did not get demolished. It would have been extraordinarily expensive, and we were informed that if we ever might possibly want to have additional space, that we were never going to be able to build anything like that and be consistent with code in that size ever again. Wow. That it sort of a speak now. And frankly, it's a great place to hold our files. It's not temperature controlled, but it's secured for our files. We got the roof taken care of. There used to be some leaking issues. It's all taken care of. But it's not usually part of the normal tour we give, because it's not particularly scenic on the, on the inside like the rest of the office that's all been made nice and new. But with that, at that time, we still have the white leather firm that is still practicing. But again, Mr. Banks is gone, Darlene Naylor is gone. Some of these folks are gone just because I suppose they eventually wanted to retire. But the Bloom firm is, again, not a separate firm. Within a year, I think, prior to his passing, joined the White Leather Bloom firm.
Right.
Terry still is trying to retire, I think, but he's still practicing as a sole practitioner. And Baber and Baber are right next to him in his office complex. The last time I've talked with them, they're still just focusing on criminal defense.
I believe so. Yeah.
So I don't want to say I don't want to count them as a firm, but in terms of an option for 70% of the stuff that we get, we can't send a lot of referral business over to them. A lot of it has to go over to White Leathers if we can't handle it. Jeff Arnold also practices here in town, but Jeff has spread his practice out a little bit. He has a footprint, I think, in Allen County as well, maybe some other counties, and does a lot of consumer bankruptcy work. And so I'm not sure how much time he spends specifically here in Whitley County, but I think we can still claim him. We have a gentleman up in Cherubusco now named Steve Grable, who practices locally. I don't think we have anybody in South Whitley or any of those areas that would have sort of taken on the Darlene Naylor mantle for that area. But again, overall, what has struck me as interesting is that even though we consider our society more litigious than it ever has been or whatever, I think we technically have fewer attorneys. We certainly have, I think, fewer law firms, general law firms here in town than we used to. And part of that may also be that folks are less hesitant to drive to Fort Wayne or drive to Warsaw or to go out of county to obtain services, and that could be part of it too. But for now, that's where the legal services sort of hold up for right now. Trying to think what else used to be interesting about the practice. The prosecutor's office for years was housed over at John Whiteleather's law office. Also, when I first moved to town, and John was the county prosecutor, but he did that as a part-time job. That was an election that was made by that office or by himself. That remained a part-time job for him until he retired from it. He had always had part-time deputies up until a gentleman, I think Dan Nelson was his first full-time deputy, and they set the prosecutor's office. Then when they consolidated over here what had been the old White Leather office, the old Bloom Law office became the prosecutor's office. And Dan Nelson, I think, was the first sort of full-time attorney that worked there. And then Matt Rentschler, after Dan Nelson left, Matt Rentschler came and he took that position there and became the deputy. And then later on, Matt ran for prosecutor. When John gave it up, he converted that from a part-time position. Matt had apparently no interest in doing private practice. Converted that from a part-time position to a full-time position as prosecutor, which is where it stays today. And of course, he ended up then running for judge, as circuit court judge. Okay, I'm trying to think if I've given
that's okay. So does your law firm specialize in anything?
Well, and we're hesitant to use the word specialize in the practice of law. There are very few times that you can appropriately apply that term. What I would say, we do general practice, and then I draw some exceptions and pull some things out of that we probably aren't going to help you with very long or very far. I'm not sure that we would ever take on any detailed intellectual property case. Right now, we are working with, we have an associate who's working on some personal injury cases, but we sometimes have referred those out. We're going to have to make a decision on where to go with those moving forward. Other than that, we will represent businesses. We will doing transactional work or business entity setup work. Or transactional work for businesses. Marcia and I both represent local municipalities and work with governmental entities and represents various boards and doing that type of thing. Marcia and I also will do estate planning and estate administration for decedents' estates.
But you're not criminal law as
Well,
such.
right, I still do some criminal defense. And I've kind of gotten out of family law personally. I will do some work with the 4D office as the referee, and I will mediate some family law cases. Sultana focuses on family law primarily and on Social Security disability. I didn't say where she was before she was with the white leather firm, but she was an employee of Social Security Administration.
Oh, okay.
And came from a staff position there into private practice, having a knowledge of how Social Security disability works, and is really a very proficient, very successful practitioner in that area, but is very comfortable with that. And as Marcia and Sultana and I have all moved past our as we move past our mid-50s, you tend to want to do the things that you're a little bit more comfortable with and not have to learn a bunch of new things. So
That was what I was going to ask too. Does being a lawyer entail going back for training?
it does. And it, I don't know whether the lawyers, I mean, there was this whole continuing education push that I think teachers, I assume librarians, doctors, most licensed professionals now have to do some sort of continuing education requirement. And the lawyers have had that in place ever since I started practice back in '89. And it's several hours of continuing legal ed a year to keep you up to date. Frankly, I think it's at least as important as ed in other places because laws do change.
Sure.
And the legislature likes to justify its existence by writing different things down and creating different laws. So there are some real benefits to trying to stay up on that. And a great example is they created the whole expungement process for criminal acts within the last 5 years. And that was something completely different. We used to tell folks there's no such thing as expungement except in very limited circumstances for juvenile matters or traffic offenses or things like some arrests. And that answer to that question, can I get this off my record, for certain offenses changed substantially a few years ago. And it was appropriate to be either reading the statutes and the information from the legislature very thoroughly and or to be going to continuing education classes. Luckily, a lot of precepts of law don't change much and have been, I don't want to say stagnant, but have been steady. There was a quote from, I heard this at a seminar I had been at one time, comparing the legal profession to the medical profession and talking about how much more slowly the legal profession moves than the medical profession. And they said, you have to understand, when the predecessors to current attorneys were writing things like the Magna Carta, predecessors to current doctors were treating people with leeches and for ill humors. So that has moved very quickly and progressed and been directly impacted by technology. While individual laws that are made change some of the legal precepts about how things are supposed to work in the sort of Anglo-American legal system have remained pretty steady over hundreds of years. So there is some new things. There are always new things to learn, but a lot of basic precepts stay very, very basic. I'll tell you one thing that's changed pretty substantially is legal research. The old Gates firm that I talked about that was on the second floor above the Farmers Loan and Trust Company Bank, it used to have, I don't say a story, but when I first moved to town, how extensive their law library was and how large their law library was at the Gates firm. And at its heyday, the Gates firm had sort of a regional grasp. They had a former governor as a partner. And it had It was a very large law library. By the time that I had moved into town and was actually going over to see Dick about different things or Ben about different things, it was, I don't know that they were keeping up all of it the way they used to, but when John and I set up our firm, one of the benefits of setting up a firm in the early 90s versus setting up a firm in the 1800s
Oh, yeah.
or in the early 1900s was that, of course, everybody is that things were done online, and or with digital.
Right.
With digital content, this is similar. You're with library, so you understand these things. But it's a situation where we do have a room in our office that we call the law library. We do keep books in it. We do have a collection of statutes in it. These are law books, but it is a shadow of what used to be considered law libraries. The county used to maintain a law library.
We kind of peeked in yesterday.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so the county used to maintain a law library, and it used to be, I think, over where Superior Court is now.
Yeah, that's what they said, yeah.
And then they moved it to the back of the Circuit Court. And probably about the same time, maybe it was the later 90s, we were asked, the local attorneys were asked how to best utilize that space, and the request was that we could use more conference rooms to talk with clients and parties to try to settle disputes. Then we need library books here that are being used by the local attorneys. So they converted the law library, for the most part, into 3 conference rooms. Now those have, as bureaucracy will work, those 3 conference rooms have turned into 2 offices and a conference room now.
Yeah.
So they've kind of been taken over. But that whole space used to be the county law library. And now the county law library is basically just that back wall, with some books in it. And it's still maintained, and it is used by the judges, and it's a couple of sets of statutes. But again, it is a kind of a shadow of its former self. So that has gone in the same way. I'm glad that you got that information when you went through the courthouse.
Yeah, it is really neat.
It is interesting, but the whole concept of at first it was digital. We were getting the research. It was on discs, and all the materials were on discs. At that point, I'm not sure. At this point, I'm not sure how much we even still get on disc. We get it's almost all online.
Sure.
And that has the whole notion of the law library has changed substantially.
It's on your MacBook.
Yep. Just go in and look at it. In some ways, it's very, very nice to be able to cut and paste a quote directly out of a case, not worry.
Or if you need to take it with you to court or wherever, you're not taking 4 armloads of stuff. You've got this little thing.
You can either take the electronic thing, or you just hit print if you don't mind still sacrificing some trees.
Yeah.
To do that, but that has changed. I think another thing in the practice of law that has changed since I've been practicing, in concert with that digitization and online resources, has been the advent of I want to say DIYers, do-it-yourselfers in terms of legal stuff, and that at some level I think is fine and good. If we really could live in a world where you did not need lawyers at all, if I really thought that was a practical option, I would find something else to do. I just am not sure what kind of a practical option, how practical that is.
Yeah, it'd be a little scary.
So when people come in, if they are trying to handle stuff themselves, at first I think most attorneys, especially if they came in with some forms that they had gotten off the internet or they had gotten from the local library, I think some attorneys were a little hostile to that. And I know I've tried to not be hostile to that, and to try to basically provide the service for people that they want, as opposed to tell them what service I will provide for them and make their need fit into what I'm comfortable providing. And there have always been some resources, fill in the blank things that were available, and the library, the local library, is where we used to, people would go for that.
We had books and books of them.
Right.
Go make a
At this
copy
point, the state itself, the state Supreme Court, has a self-service legal
Yep.
portal that you can go to. The problem with that is if you're in your second or third divorce, you probably
got her down,
You
yeah.
probably can go through that and figure it out. But if you really are first time, if you've been married for 20 years and you're getting divorced and you're trying to figure out what a provisional order is and whether I need this or whether I don't need that, that portal may not be very user-friendly in and of itself. It's nothing wrong with the portal or with the effort to set it up. It's just
the
the nomenclature, the whole understanding
Yeah.
of how it's supposed to work. And so there have been times where folks have come in with some of this paperwork and had it partially filled out. And I try to walk them through it and provide a little bit of assistance. We have to be careful our role as attorneys and the ethical rules that govern that sometimes seem to be a little restrictive on how we can provide those services. But I like to think that for the most part, what we should be doing is helping people to navigate the legal system. If you have to do that, or if it's appropriate to do that in the old traditional role as an advocate and represent their interests, I think that's fine. If it is a newer role in basically explaining what a provisional order is to a couple that both come in and they both know they want to get divorced and they don't want to each hire attorneys and they don't want to spend thousands of dollars, then you can maybe help walk them through that. In doing that, though, you have to be very careful that they do understand that you aren't representing either
Right.
one of them, and that if they later on if this gets acrimonious, they will each have to hire their own attorneys.
Yeah, because I've already spoken to you.
Because I've spoken with both of you as a couple trying to fish through this stuff, and now I'm not going to represent one against the other. That's so there are some trade-offs like that, and those were part of the reasons I think that some attorneys were hesitant to try to do that. But that's I think the world we live in. You live in a world, I'm sure doctors do too, where somebody comes in and they've done hours of research before they come in and ask you about something. And I don't mind that, because oftentimes that starts the conversation out
Sure.
in a more advanced place, and you can start the conversation saying why this isn't like the law you may have read about on the internet, or how your situation may be slightly different, or about how, hey, I think that may be the way it is in Michigan or California, but I don't think that's the way it is here in Indiana. And you can have that kind of discussion, because most folks, I think, are bright enough to understand their particular legal circumstances. Where I think they need help is somebody to point them as to where the sources of law are that are going to be applicable to that, and to give them some insight as to how those situations generally work and how the law generally applies to those situations. And that might be maybe things that aren't as obvious or clear, because there's a lot of garbage on the internet too.
Oh boy.
There's a lot of garbage out there. There's a lot of good information. And I will note that the other day I found a resource that's absolutely free, Google Scholar, that does not really replace Lexis or Westlaw, but that is not a bad service that's readily available. But again, some of the nomenclature, if you're trying to read that as a layperson, is going to be real cumbersome. Frankly, especially with older cases where the folks writing the judges writing these never had any idea that anybody but lawyers or other judges would be reading this stuff.
Sure.
Oh. Anything else?
Feel better now?
Yeah.
All right.
Not at
See,
all.
this doesn't hurt anything.
No.
But no. Anything else you'd like to add? Anything else you can think of?
No, I other than, well, I said no other than. Well, I think that the legal field locally will continue to evolve as it is nationally. We now have LegalZoom. We now have actual services that are provided, sort of, which is weird, because at the same time, I think as many or more people are going to law school than ever have. So it's going to be interesting as to where all these folks actually fit into this new sort of system as to how law is practiced, and that's going to be curious. Some of these are things that I don't know. We'll just have to kind of wait and see and watch how it happens. I thought an education as a lawyer was, I was asked when I was finishing up law school what kind of law I wanted to practice or what I wanted to do. My response at that time was, all I know is I don't want to be a student anymore. I had been a student for a long time. I said I may work at
Right.
McDonald's. I'll be really a very talkative legal guy at McDonald's or someplace. I just don't want to do this anymore, being a student. But it is a good background, not to tell you how everything works, but to give you an idea of some basic approaches to how to do some problem solving and dispute resolving and research and things like that. I would equate it to some certain library science things, degrees, where you're not going to know the answer to look.
Right.
Anyway, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
Learned a lot.
Did you really?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes, really did. So we appreciate it, and we
You're
will
welcome.
see you around.
See you around. All right.